Today is Tzaditet 99, and we are at the last line, the very last line of Tzadichet Amud Bet, where it says Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Harutzim ayu kerashim, v'chalulim ayu ha'adanim. And if you remember all this stuff, in just a few weeks from now, you will be able to apply it to Parashat Terumah and the description of the Mishkan, which is that the way that and if you look on the side here, if you have a regular edition of the Talmud, they have on the side at the bottom a little drawing of what they mean. That the way that the kerashim were designed, the way that the way that the boards were designed was almost with two teeth. The bottom of them was cut out, and there were two teeth sticking out. And these were inserted into the adanim, into those metal bases, those copper bases that they would be slid into. So that's what it means. Chalulim hayu adanim. They were hollow. The bases were hollow, and the kerashim were made to be inserted into them. So that basically the bottom of the kerashim and the base were as one. Okay, so that it didn't add any height to the kerashim because they were inserted directly into them. And now we turn to Tzaditet Amud Aleph, very first word. V'nir'in kerasin belulaot kekochavim barakia. These points really don't have anything specific to do with anything we've talked about up till now, or anything we're really going to talk about. Just that we were on the topic of the construction of the Mishkan and its relevance to Hilchot Shabbat. So we're mentioning a few more points, which is that in the Mishkan they had they divided the curtains of the Mishkan, the roof of the Mishkan, into two parts. Each one was made of 5 pieces. So the 5 pieces were sewn together, and one unit of 5 pieces sewn together, and then the 2 units were hooked together. They had hooks, golden hooks. They had blue loops on one side and golden hooks on the other side. So the golden hooks would fit into the blue loops, and that was how the 2 halves were put together. So if you imagine one unit which is actually made up of 5 different curtains, and you want to latch it onto another unit made of 5 curtains, so there were loops and there were hooks, and they attached one to the other. So it says that these looked like a kochavim barakia. They looked like stars in the sky because the color was blue of these curtains, this fabric, and the hooks. So you had these blue rings, and then you had these hooks that were shiny of metal, so that it looked like, if you looked up above you, since they were right in the center, because that was where the 2 halves met, so it would look like stars twinkling in the sky above you.
What was the color of the curtain?
What? Well, it was made of different, they were made of different fabrics, like blue and purple and woven together. Actually, that's the very next part. That the lower covering was made of blue and purple and red and silk. And the one above it was made of Maaseh Izim, was made of goat's hair. And the wisdom that's spoken of with respect to designing the curtains that were below is less than the one above. Or to put it the way that the Talmud says, that the wisdom that was necessary to make the upper covering was greater than the wisdom necessary to make the lower covering. Why? Because it says with regard to the lower covering, that all women who were wise of heart would spin with their hands. But with regard to the upper covering, it says that all the women who were uplifted, whose hearts were uplifted with wisdom, wove the goats themselves. In other words, as we learned earlier in the Masekhet, that they would weave the threads while the hair was still attached to the goats, which was really, really hard to do. They did that apparently because once you detach the hair from the goats, the quality, the luster of it diminishes somewhat. So they wanted to have it while it was still attached to its original source, and therefore they actually spun the threads while they were still attached to the goats, which is obviously no easy task. V'tanya mishum Rabbi Nechemya, and it was brought taught in a Braita in the name of Rabbi Nechemya, Shatuf ba'izim v'tavui min ha'izim, that they would wash the coat, basically, of the hair of the goats while the hair was still attached to the goats, and they would spin the threads out of the hair of the goats while it was still attached to the goats. How they did that, I have no idea, but it was a special art, and therefore it required even more ingenuity to do those than to do the lower curtains where the fabric was already separated from its source of growth before it was spun. So now we move to the next part, back to the halacha. Shetei guzuz traot. There are two balconies, as we said. The two balconies, the Mishnah mentioned that if you have two balconies along the side of the Reshut Harabim and you pass from one to the other, that it is considered a melachav carrying, because this is the way that the Levi'im used to carry. They would have two agalot, they would have two wagons, one in front of the other, and they would pass from one to the next. Now the Gemara says, Amar Rav Mishum Rabbi Chia, Rav said in the name of Rabbi Chia, Agalot tachtehenu benehem v'tzidehen Reshut Harabim, as we said yesterday, that underneath the wagons and between the wagons and next to the wagons were all considered Reshut Harabim. Amar Rabbi Abai says, Ben agala agala kimlo orech agala, that between each one of the wagons, remember we said yesterday, the wagons were 5 amot in width, and you had two next to each other. And in between the two was also 5 amot of width. Okay? That's what it means. In between each agala was the size of an agala. V'kama orech agala, what is the length? So that is 5 amot, 5 amot. So the Gemara asks, Lama li, why do you have 5 amot? Be'arba'u palga sagi, 4.5 should be enough, because as we said yesterday, if they were to put it would be possible for them to even lay the boards flat. There were 1.5 amot across, right? If you were to lay them flat, the width was 1.5 amot. They could put 3 stacks next to each other, and it only takes 4.5 amot. So why do they need a 5 amma? So it says because they didn't want to squeeze them together. They wanted to give them space, so they made it 5 amot. And anyway, as we said yesterday, the way that we described it yesterday, they actually put them not flat on their width, but they actually put them on their point standing up, which was 1 amma rather than 1.5 amot. So then the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, Tzidei agala kimlo rochav agala, v'chama rochav agala shetei amot mechatza. So the Gemara says that actually, if you really deconstruct, so to speak, the way that the agalot were, from one wall of the agala to the other was actually 2.5 amot. That's all. And then what did you have? You had a total of 2.5 amot, 1.25 amot from the left side of the agala to the wheel, because the wheel extended 1.25 amot out from the body of the wagon, and on the other side also 1.25 amot to the right side. So the total span was, if you wanted to park this thing, okay, you would need 5 amot, because you're going to have 2.5 of the body, and then you're going to have 2.5 total of wheels, 1.25 jutting out on one side and 1.25 jutting out on the other side, for a total of another 2.5. So from one wheel, from the end of one wheel to the end of the other wheel is 5, but from one wheel to the body is 1.25. From the other wheel to the body is 1.25, and from the wall to wall is 2.5. Right? So you had so that was the way that it was constructed. So the Gemara asks, Lama li, why do you need 2.5? Be'amtau palgasagya, why can't you just have 1.5 width of the agala? Since you're going to lay the boards across anyway, it's not like you're going to fit them in. So why can't it just be 1.5? Why did it have to be 2.5 like that? So the answer is because if it's less than 2.5 amot, if the body of the wagon is less than 2.5 amot, then what's going to happen is you're going to have these karashim, you have these boards that are 10 amot long, and they're going to be laying across, and if you center them so that 2.5 amot are on the wagon, so then at least you have the 2.5 amot resting on the wagon. If you only had 1.5 amot of this large board resting on the wagon, it would teeter, this way and that way. There wouldn't be enough. It would fall forward or fall backwards, so it wouldn't remain stable. So in order to let it remain stable, they had to have at least 2.5. In other words, at least a quarter of the length of the keresh had to be resting on the wagon in order for it to remain stable. So then the Gemara says, Ella, but we have a question to Kaimalam, because we have a principle, Derech Reshut Harabim Shesh Esrei Ama Anana Degamrinan Lami Mishkan. The Mishkan Chamesrei Havai. So the problem is like this: that we learned in a Baraita that a Reshut HaRabim is 16 amot wide, and we also said that our model for a Reshut HaRabim is the Mishkan. And here we see that you just told me that the space of the agalot taken up by the agalot is a Reshut HaRabim. But wait a second, the space taken up by the agalot is only 15 amot. Because now Rashi explains what it means. Because you have 5 amot of agala number 1. The 5 amot in between the agala, and the 5 amot of agala number 2. So even though, if you were to count the amount that stretches out of the boards past the agala, it goes even further, right? We don't care about that. Because the boards are not the Reshut HaRabim. It's below that's really the Reshut HaRabim. So we're only concerned about from the side, from the wheel of agala number 1.
From here.
Right, from the wheel of agala number 1, all the way to the outside wheel of agala number 2 is a total of 15 amot. So the question is, that's only 15 amot. They're not counting the boards that stick out 2.5 past the wheels.
To the end,
right. They're only counting up to the wheels because those boards are not really part of the Reshut HaRabim. That's what Rashi says. Only the middle part is. The part in between the agalot to the end. That's all. So what does the Gemara say? So why don't we say 15 is a Reshut HaRabim? Why is it 16? So the Gemara says, answer is that amta yetera havai. There was an extra amma here. Dahavaka e ben Levi, that a ben Levi, that one of the Levi'im would walk alongside. Okay, he would walk alongside in order to make sure that the boards didn't slip. And the Gemara says, "Deki mishtalfei kerashim havana kit lahum." That if one of the boards started to slip off of its pile, he would put it back. So Rashi explains on the bottom that they had actually a half of an amma to the side of one agala, and a half of an amma to the side of the other, for a total of 1 amma total. So there was a person standing, let's say, on the right side of agala number 2, the agala on this side, and to the outside of agala number 1, okay? So the outside of each agala, not in between them obviously, outside, and then if one would slip, he would fix it. So that extra half amma that he took up, on the right side and the left side, that the two helpers took up, is counted as the Reshut HaRabim. So that's why we have 16 in total, from where the guy stands next to the agala on the outside to where the other guy stands on the agala on the other side. It's going to be 16 amot of a span, and that's the measurement of a Reshut HaRabim. So now we come to the next Mishnah, Chuliyat Tabor, that the dirt of a pit, ve'asela, or a rock, shehen gevohin asara urchavan arba'a, that they are 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim in 4 by 4, 4 square tefachim in size. Hanotel vehen vehanoten al gaban chayav pachot miken patur. Now we learned this idea before, that if you have a structure that you want to consider a private domain, even if it's in the middle of a public domain, if the measurements are 10 tefachim high, and a tefach is about this much, so 10 tefachim high, let's say 30 inches, whatever that is, and it has to be 4 by 4 tefachim in its width and length. So it has to have a space of 4 by 4 tefachim, and it has to be 10 tefachim high in order to qualify as a Reshut HaRabim.
If it's round, it would have to be a radius of 4, or would it be a total square of 4, a total pi r squared of 4?
If it's round, we talked about it earlier, it has to be so that you could cut out a square 4 by 4. So here we're saying that, let's say you dug a pit. The pit is 8 tefachim deep, but the dirt, you lined the dirt around the outside of the pit. So you kind of made a wall of dirt. So if you were in the pit, there would be a wall more than 10 tefachim over you, because the wall of the actual pit, and then the dirt around the pit that's actually outside the pit, but it's on the lip of the pit, so it's going even higher. So it doesn't matter that from somebody standing on the edge of the pit, they only see it coming up 3 tefachim, let's say. But counting the wall of the pit, let's say it goes down another 7 or whatever, so in there is a Reshut HaYachid. Now let's say you have a big rock in the middle of the public domain. The rock is 10 tefachim high, and it's 4 by 4, like you see those big rocks in parks sometimes. So that would be considered, again, a Reshut HaYachid, even though it's sitting in the Reshut HaRabim. And if you were to take something from the Reshut HaRabim and put it on that rock, or take something off the rock, bring it into the public domain, that would be considered a transfer, even though it doesn't seem like it's a separate domain. It's just a rock, but it's large enough to be considered an entity in its own right. That is the novelty here.
4 tefachim on each side, so 2 by 8.
4 by 4.
It's not 16 square.
It has to be 4 by 4. 4 length, 4 width.
2 by 1.
So if it's an oval, that's 3.5 by 100
it has to be the
tefachim,
right. It has to be the size that you could carve out of it a 4 by 4.
4 by 4. So if it's like 100 tefachim by 3.5.
You mean it's so narrow?
Yeah, because it's so narrow. It's an oval. It's
2 by 8.
Right. So any measurement.
Work.
It doesn't seem like that works. It seems like it has to be at least 4 tefachim in its width.
Yeah, so
otherwise, it's too small.
In other words, it's not in a surface area.
I don't think it's total surface area.
Yeah,
it is that it has to be a 4, even like in sukkah. Also, if you have a circular sukkah, you have to make sure that you can carve out of it the minimum measurement of a square. So it has to be larger as a circle to be able to do that. It can't be 4 by 4. So, all right. So now we say like this. Gemara says, "Lama limitnei chuliyata bor v'hasela litnei bor v'hasela." Why do you have to tell me about the dirt of the pit? Why don't you just tell me about the pit itself? Why do you have to bring in the dirt? Misayale le Rabbi Yochanan. So this is supporting Misayale le Rabbi Yochanan, the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said, Bor vechulyata mitzarfin asara, to teach you that even though they seem like two separate entities, that from the perspective of the person standing on the edge of the pit, all he sees is the dirt that comes up from the floor, from the ground. And only from the perspective of the person sitting in the pit is it going to seem like there's a wall of 10 tefachim. Still, they combine together. That if you had a pit in the public domain and it's 10 tefachim deep and it's 4 tefachim wide, in other words, it's 4 tefachim wide square, okay? So there, if it's filled with water, let's say you have a well. The well is 10 tefachim deep. The well is 4 by 4 in its dimensions, and you want to draw water from that well and take it in, and sit in the public domain and drink it. You can't do it because you'll be transferring the water from the private domain to the public domain. Unless basically you made an eruv. In other words, you made a wall. You have to make a wall of 10 tefachim around that area. And if you make a wall around that area of 10 tefachim, so the whole area, in other words, let's say this cup is the well. But around it is a public domain. If I take water out of the well, since the well has the dimensions of a private domain, I'm really taking from the private domain into the public domain to drink it. So what can I do? I can make a fence around the well, and so now the whole area around the well is also a private domain, and I'm just taking from private to private, and that would be okay. And the Gemara says, and if you don't put up this mechitza, apparently, so then you cannot even stand next to it and drink from it. Unless your head and the majority of your body is inside the place where you're drinking, because otherwise we're afraid you're going to take it back with you into the place where the majority of your body rests, and you're going to end up carrying it, transferring it. Okay, so now we say ubor b'chuliyatam mitzarfin la'asara, and it also said that the bor, the pit and its dirt that's lined up around it combine to make a wall. So we count both the subterranean and the dirt that's on top of the pit as part of the wall. Then ba'amine Rav Mordechai me Rabbah, it should probably be according to the corrections that are brought. It should be Rabbah, and there's a reason for this, because historically, as we're going to see the list of Rabbanim here. Rabbah would be the first one to be asked, because we're going to see then Rav Yosef is asked, and then finally Abaye is asked, and therefore he went in order of precedence. Rabbah and Rav Yosef were the leaders of that generation, so he goes to Rabbah with the question, he goes to Rav Yosef, and then finally he goes to Abaye, who was his colleague, who was one of the students. So Rav Mordechai asked Rabbah the following question: Amud b'reshut harabim gavoa yud u'verachav dalet. If you had a pillar in the public domain which is 10 tefachim high and it is 4 by 4 in its dimension, v'zarak v'nachal gabav, and you threw something from the public domain and it landed on this pillar, mahu, what are you going to say? Mi amrinan, are you going to say that Harei Akira Be'isur? Look, Harei Hanacha Be'isur. He picked it up in the public domain and it landed in the private domain, because the pillar is counted as a private domain. It's got 4 by 4 tefachim and it's got 10 tefachim tall. Or maybe you're going to say this, that since when you throw something, what do? You throw it high, and then it comes down, right? You can't throw. So you threw it and it curved. So let's say this is the pillar. So you're standing down here. You throw it like this. It lands. So it goes above 10 tefachim. In order to land on something 10 tefachim, it has to go a little bit above. But we know that in the public domain, above 10 tefachim is nothing. It's called mekom patur. right? So the minute you threw it up into the air and it goes 11 tefachim, in order to land on the 10 tefachim place, it's already gone out of the Rishut HaRabim. So basically, you transferred it into the Mekom Petur, and then it landed on the Rishut in the Rishut HaYachid. So you didn't transfer it directly. So do we say, listen, the point of departure and the destination are both a problem, because it left the public domain, it landed in the private domain, but it traveled through Mekom Petur along the way. So what is the halacha? Now Tosafot and many of the other Rishonim go bonkers on this, because we said many times that it doesn't matter. If you transfer something, right? If you transfer something from a private to a public and you walked through your front yard, remember we learned about that.
Right. Yeah.
It shouldn't make a difference that it traveled through, as long as you didn't put it down there. If you put it down in the Mekom Petur and then you transferred it, fine. But if you walk through a domain that is neither public nor private along the way from the private to the public domain and vice versa, we've already said many times it doesn't make a difference. So Tosafot gives a suggestion here that there's a difference, because in those cases you're carrying the item. So it's one continuous act of carrying. You picked it up in the house, you walked through an area which was neither private nor public. And if you had put it down there, you would have been exempt, but you didn't. You kept walking. So it's all one action. But here, when you lob the ball or whatever it is, and you want it to land here, you throw it up, and gravity actually brings it down. Gravity pulls it down. So it's two separate actions in a way. Like if you look at it from a physics perspective, like vectors perspective, right? So you're really dealing with two different things, okay? You're dealing with the straight, your motion, and then you're dealing with gravity's exertion of influence on that's pulling it down. So really, you threw it into the Mekom Petur, and God, gravity pulled it back down. So that's why it's a question, according to Tosafot.
Is that the one where they had also brought the example where you throw something and it gets stuck in the wall?
That's going to come up later.
Right.
Wait, hold on to that thought. Okay? So anyway, so he asked the question, and then Amar Le said to him, so it says, so then Amar Le said to him, so Rabbah said, Matnitinhi, it's a Mishnah, why are you asking me? Rav Yosef. So then he went and asked Rav Yosef, who was the other leader of that generation. There's a famous Gemara about Rabbah and Rav Yosef that I believe was in Masekhet Berachot. It's also in Masekhet Horayot, but I believe we saw it in Masekhet Berachot about how they had to make a decision who was going to be the Rosh Yeshiva. Should it be Rabbah or Rav Yosef? And Rabbah ended up being the head of the yeshiva, and Rav Yosef waited his turn, and therefore he lived longer, because he knew that Rabbah was going to become the leader soon, and he would die for Rabbah to take his place. So he didn't become the leader. So he went to Rav Yosef. Amar Le said to him again, Matnitinhi. It's a Mishnah. Why are you asking me? So he went to his colleague Abaye and he said, Amar Le Matnitini. He said to him, it's a Mishnah. Why are you bothering me? Amar Lahu, he said to them, you're all spitting the same spit. In other words, you're all giving me the same line. But what is the Mishnah you're talking about? You're telling me it's a Mishnah, but you're not telling me what it is. What kind of answer is this? I need some information here. So Amar Levad lo tizbera. Don't you know? V'atznan, it says in the Mishnah, Hanotel mehen v'noten al gaban chayav. We just read the Mishnah that if you put something onto a rock that is 10 tefachim tall and is 4 by 4 in its dimensions, chayav, whether you transferred it back and forth from the rock or it doesn't matter, you moved it from a private to a public domain. Amar Le said to him, Dilma matnitin b'machat. Maybe that case of our Mishnah is talking about a needle. A needle really doesn't have any dimensions. So even though, true, when you wanted to put it down, it has to travel through the Mekom Petur, it has to travel through the exempt area above 10 tefachim and land on the rock, still it's a needle, so it's negligible. So he says to him, that's not a good argument, because machat nami efshar delo medalya porta, even a needle, its negligible amount is still an amount. So it says the idle morsham. Maybe our Mishnah is talking about a case inami dramya bacharitza. Either that there was a protrusion coming out of the rock, or maybe that there was a hole in the rock. So either way, you were able to place it on. In other words, the point is that the rock has dimensions of 10 tefachim tall and 4 by 4 width and length. It doesn't matter where on that rock your item rests. Okay, maybe it had a little crevice and you put it in there. Maybe it had a little protrusion and you put it on there, and the object didn't have to ascend beyond the 10 tefachim of the public domain and go into that exempt area in order to land on the rock. For one reason or another, it didn't have to. Now, this is obviously problematic because I just told you that Tosafot says that the whole case is only significant because he threw it and gravity caused it to land. So apparently they're going to have to say that they're interpreting this case the same way. That they're interpreting the case of the rock, that you lobbed it over onto the rock and it landed. So he's saying that maybe it's a situation where you didn't have to throw it higher than the rock for it to land on the rock because the rock had like a little piece sticking out that it landed on. And therefore, it never actually ascended above 10 tefachim, because if it did, then that would mean that by going up, it left into an exempt area, which is above 10 tefachim over the public area, and it came down.
Is Tosfot's view the accepted view?
Well, in the end, we don't need it, because in the end, we rule that it's fine. I mean, that it counts anyway, that it doesn't matter.
So it's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant, basically. Yeah. It's just a theoretical question of what was the Gemara thinking here? What was Rav Mordechai thinking here? In the end, the halakha doesn't follow. He tries to say, well, the Mishnah is not clearly supporting one view or another, but the halakha follows the view that it doesn't matter, that even though the item went out into the Makom Patur and landed on this private domain, what counts as a private domain, that's all we need to know is where it left and where it landed. So now the Gemara says, Amar Rav Maisha. Rav Maisha said, Ba'e Rabbi Yochanan, reported that Rabbi Yochanan asked the following question. Kotel b'reshut harabim gavoa yud, ve'eno rachav arba'a. Let's say you have a fence, for example. So this fence is 10 tefachim tall, which means it's at least 30 inches tall. But it is not, by itself, it's not 4 by 4 in width and length, right? It's thin. It's a fence, or it's a wall. So it's thin. So by itself, right? So by itself, this wall would not be a reshut hayachid. If it were just standing in the middle of a public domain, you would say, well, it's got the height, but it doesn't have the width. Yeah. Okay. However, the only thing is that this fence or this wall, okay, is umukaf lekarmalit va'asao reshut hayachid. This wall is around a karmalit. It's around an area that it makes a private domain. So the wall by itself is sitting in a public domain, but the thing is that what's inside it has created a private domain. So the question is, do we look at the wall around the private domain as a part of the private domain? Or do we look at the wall around the private domain? In other words, is the private domain the space inside? Or is the private domain the space plus the walls? That's the question. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does the wall itself, in other words, does the wall itself part of the private domain? Because the wall itself doesn't have the dimensions of a private domain, but it created a private domain because the area that it's fencing around.
In other words, so as soon as the wall is put in, the wall then becomes part of
the reshut hayachid. Do we or not? Is it or not? That's the question.
Right.
Okay. So that's what he's asking. So he says. So now he says v'zrak v'nachal gabav. So let's say for example, there's a park and there's a fence around the park. Okay. So now that area becomes a private domain. But the fence itself is not a private domain. It's just that it makes that area a private domain. And you threw an object and it landed on the fence. It didn't land inside. So what do we say? Do we look at it as, that's a fence situated in the public domain because I'm standing in the public domain and I just threw it? Or do we look at the other side? Hey, that fence is actually creating a private domain on the other side.
Exactly, because it has implications both ways.
Right, both sides is significant. So what do we say? So he says, Mi amrina, so mahu, mi amrinan kevan deno rachav dalid makom pitur hu. Do we say that since it doesn't have the thickness, it doesn't have the width of 4 amot, for tefachim, we're going to say that it is makom pitur. It's considered to be a makom pitur, an exempt area. It's nothing. It's just above 10 tefachim in a public domain, so it doesn't have any identity. Or maybe we say that since it creates inside a private domain, it itself, it's like the private domain is totally full, it's totally a solid entity, and this is the edge of that solid entity. We look at the entire Reshut HaYachid, that private domain, as a solid entity. So the fact that it fell on the wall is as if it's inside. It's the same. So the Gemara says, Amar Ula Ula says, Kal V'chomer. It's a Kal V'chomer. La'achirim osa mechitza, or osem mechitza, la'atzmo lo kol sheken. If it makes something else a private domain, doesn't it make itself a private domain? In other words, if it is part of the very definition of the private domain. It's creating the private domain. It is the wall of the private domain. It itself must be part of the private domain too.
I feel like we've already gone through all.
A lot of this is very similar. A lot of this is rehashing. Absolutely. So the Gemara says, "Itmar nami." We stated similarly. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav. That Rabbi Chia bar Ashi said that Rav said. V'chein Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Rabbi Yochanan. And similarly, Rabbi Yitzchak said that Rabbi Yochanan said. That Rabbi Yochanan said, "Kotel b'Reshut Rabim." If you had a wall in the Reshut Rabim gavoy yud ve'eno rachav arba'a umukaf lecharmelit v'asor Reshut Yachid hazorek v'nachal gabav chayav. That in this case, in fact, the conclusion was that if you throw whatever it is and it lands on this fence, it is considered that you transferred it to the private domain. Because if it makes the space within it a private domain, it itself is part of it. And Tosafot says that the reason why it mentions a Karmelit here and not a Reshut Harabim is because if it were a fence that transformed a public domain into a private domain, then certainly it would be. There's not even a question. Certainly, that would be part of the private domain. So that's the way that Tosafot says. So for example, that would be relevant. Like you're walking by what? He says because it's such a significant transformation, transforming from a Carmelite to a private domain. Maybe you'll say it's not as fundamental of a transformation because a Carmelite is already is not as serious. Right.
Which would differ it from a threshold, because a threshold also has something similar, except the threshold you calculate also what's above it.
Right.
But a threshold would be the same thing, but the threshold does not modify the place.
It doesn't modify the place, right. So now the Gemara says, the significance is because the power of it is greater. Because to turn something which biblically is not really a problem anyway into a private domain is not such a big deal. So maybe I'll say we're there.
It's turning something into something else,
but are you going to really say that? Maybe you'll just say it's a Carmelite because it's just making a Carmelite into a private domain. So maybe we're not going to elevate it to that status in that case. We're just You could say that when you might argue, like theoretically, from a theoretical standpoint, that when you turn a Carmelite, which is really incomplete, it's neither a private nor a public domain. So when you turn that into a private domain, you're just really removing the rabbinical prohibition of Carmelite. You're not really making a Reshut Yachid. You're just removing a prohibition. But when you take a public domain and make it into a private domain, then you're affecting a biblical status. It's a real status, the change. So there the walls are going to be considered to really be a part of that in a more significant way. That's what the Tosafot is saying. Well, because that's the way that they're saying. Okay, so only because a Carmelite you can say isn't really anything. It's really nothing. So the fact that you made it into a Reshut Yachid, you didn't really do anything biblically. It's not. It's just that the rabbis didn't make their gezerah in that case where it has a wall.
Well, the thing is, one of those views has to be accepted because either view that you adopt is going to give you implication one way
or the other. Right? It's significant. Right? It's significant. Yeah, because let's say you're walking by, somebody has a fence around their yard. Okay, and you're walking by and you put something from the public domain onto the fence. It's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So you take the leniencies on one side. It's going to be a stringency
on the other side. Yeah, and that's the way that it goes. Right? So now the Gemara says, the Gemara asks some other really interesting theoretical questions here. They're very interesting. So yeah. He says, Ba'e Rabbi Yochanan asked a question like this. Bor tish'a, let's say you have a pit that is 9 tefachim deep. Va'akar mimenu chulya, and you take dirt out of the bottom of the pit. Ve'yishlimala asara, and as you take it out, you just made it 10 tefachim deep. So basically, if it were 10 tefachim deep before, it would be a private domain. You made it a private domain by what you took out. So your act of picking up the object and the creation of the status of private domain are happening simultaneously. So when you actually picked it up, it wasn't a private domain yet, because through your picking it up, it became a private domain. So what happens then? So are we going to say that since in your act of picking up you render it a private domain, that counts as having taken something out of a private domain? Or did you pick it up from really a nothing? It was a nothing because it was only 9 tefachim. And now you made it a private domain, but it's too late. You already picked it up. Okay? So now we say, and if you're going to tell me that, well, since there wasn't 10 tefachim when you picked it up, it's not going to count. What about the opposite case? Bor Yud. Let's say you took something from the public domain. You took dirt from the public domain and you put it into a pit that had 10 tefachim, which would have been a private domain, but the only thing was that by putting it down, you diminished it. So now you made it only 9 tefachim. Wow. So it's sort of the reverse, okay? So instead of it being when you picked it up, you made it a private domain. Putting it down, you removed it from being a private domain. So what is that? So hanachat chevetz v'zlug mechitza b'hadei adrekatu u'mechayev or lo mechayev. So maybe there you'll say that, well, when it originally came to rest, it landed in a private domain. It's just that now it made it into a nothing. Okay, or do we say that no, since it happened simultaneously, the existence of the private domain cannot be eliminated by the very placement of the object? So now they try to solve this problem. So the Gemara asks, why can't Rabbi Yochanan figure out the answer to his question from something else that he himself said? Titzran, as we learned earlier in this Masekhet, and this is what you were referring to before, Hazarek arba amot bakotel, if you throw 4 amot in the public domain, and it lands on the wall, if the wall, and we're assuming that this wall is not a private domain, this is just a thin wall standing in the public domain, so if it landed above 10 tefachim, we say kisorek ba'avir, it's like you threw it in the air, because above 10 tefachim in the public domain is not significant. But if it's under 10, kisorek ba'aretz, it's like you threw it on the ground. And obviously if you throw something 4 amot in the public domain, that is chayav. There you are liable for violating Shabbat. So they asked a question, how could you say that if you threw it on the wall that you're liable? It didn't rest. It didn't come to rest. So what did we answer? Do you remember Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan said that we're talking about a thick date, that basically it stuck to the wall. So you threw it 4 amot and it stuck to the wall. So now the Gemara says, so therefore, va'amai hakamima'et me'arba amot. So Rashi says that this means like this, that you threw this exactly 4 amot, and it landed against the wall. But the fact that it landed against the wall means that it just diminished the 4 amot. Because rather than come to rest, it's resting like this, so it's actually resting at 3.9 amot, let's say, instead of 4. That's how Rashi's interpreting the case, that it diminished the 4. In other words, in the very landing of the object is a shortening of the distance. Tosafot doesn't like this interpretation at all. He says this can't be right, because we already learned earlier in the Masekhet that if an object is not completely transferred, if part of it is still resting within the domain that it was leaving, it's not considered to be transferred yet. Remember the kupa, the basket, that's resting half in one domain and half in the other? It has to totally move. So if this date is like partially within 3.9 amot from where you threw it, it wouldn't even be considered transferred yet. So how could that be it? So the Tosafot instead brings a different idea, that what it means is, he says here that it's talking about a situation where it went past 4 amot, but the only thing is that the place where it lands is no longer considered a reshut harabim, because it becomes a part of the wall. In other words, what they're saying is just like the case, Tosafot interprets it, that just like the case where you deposit the dirt from the public domain into the pit, and by putting it in the pit, you actually stop it from being a private domain because you just made the pit less deep, okay, more shallow. So too, by throwing this date and then it gets attached to the wall, it didn't land in the public domain anymore because it became part of the wall. Just like your dirt became part of the floor of the pit, instead of it being that you put dirt down in a pit, you actually just made your dirt part of the pit. Okay, so too, by throwing this date and it sticks to the wall, it becomes part of the wall, so it didn't really land in the public domain, it became part of the wall. That's how Tosafot interprets it. So the Gemara answers, and actually the answer of the Gemara fits nicely with Tosafot's interpretation, that what he says is, Hatam lo mivatelle, hacham mivatelle, that in the case of the date, you don't actually want it to remain as part of the wall. You're not going to say, look at the beautiful addition I made to the wall. Whereas when you drop the dirt in the pit, it's going to stay there. It's going to become part of the floor of the pit. So that's why in the case of the floor of the pit, it's a bigger question, because basically you just did an improvement on, or you qualified the pit in some way, as opposed to the date, which is just stuck there. Okay, now obviously what recommends Rashi's interpretation here, although it's problematic because of what we said, is that it says that you limited the 4 amot, implying that it didn't travel the full 4 amot. It's a very difficult. Right, that's the problem. That's the problem. I agree. That's the problem with it. That's absolutely the problem with it. Yeah. So it's a big problem. I'm not sure what the answer is.
The date is under the 4 amot.
No, but that would be a problem. That would be a problem because if half of the object is still not in, it's not going to count. We already had that, so it's a very difficult Rashi. So Ba'ir Rava asked the following question: Zarak daf, if you threw a board, v'nachal gabei yitedot mahu. So basically, you have some, let's say some little sticks that are, that are 10 tefachim tall, and you threw a board and it lands on them. So now what ends up happening is that you've created a private domain. So you threw it from the public domain, and when it lands, what happens? It creates a private domain. Okay? Because it made the surface. Okay? So it made the surface because the sticks that were there were not 4 by 4 tefachim, but this board is. So when it lands on the sticks, each stick by itself was nothing, because each stick by itself was just a stick and it was less than 4 by 4 tefachim. But when your board lands on it, now it makes it a platform. Right? You just made a platform, right? Right? Yeah, exactly. So what happens there? Do we say that you transferred that board from the public to the private domain? So mahu. So he says, so the Gemara asks, Mai kami bayale? What is his question? He's asking the same exact question that Rabbi Yochanan was asking. I know Rabbi Yochanan. He's asking the same question as Rabbi Yochanan, that when you create the mechitza, at the very moment that the object lands, it creates the domain. Is it the same? It's the same question as Rabbi Yochanan. Of course, here it's slightly different because Rabbi Yochanan had a case where picking up the object created the domain, because you picked up and you made it 10 tefachim deep. He also had when you put it down and you removed it from being a domain. He didn't have a case where putting it down created the domain. So that is different for Rava, because Rava is saying that you put it down and created the domain. We have 3 cases. Case number 1 was you picked the dirt up, and when you picked the dirt up, you actually made it a private domain by making it deep enough. Case number 2 was you put the dirt down, and when you put the dirt down, you made it not deep enough. Okay? Case number 3 is when you put it down, you made the domain. So that's similar to case 1. In other words, the action is creating the domain, except in the first case, it was picking up the dirt that made the domain. In this case, it's putting down the board that makes the domain, but it's basically the same thing. That's what the Gemara is saying.
Problems with creating and making.
These are other issues, but I guess they're makeshift. Taking out the dirt. Taking out the dirt from the putting down the dirt. Right, you've got other. Yeah, you're gonna have other issues with moving dirt. Yeah, bonnet probably. Yeah, you're gonna have other issues. You're gonna have other issues here, but it's not dealing with those issues at this time. So there, it's the same question. So the Gemara says ki kami bayale le Rava. Rather, what Rava is asking is as follows: what happens if you throw this board with an object on the board? So what happens? So what do we say? Kevan de bahade hadeke atu kahana kharchevet vasiyat mechitza dame o dilma kevan de la efshar de lo midalya porta vahadar naich. So what it says is like this, that the answer is that if you throw an object, so in the other cases, the object being dropped or the object being picked up was the same as part of the domain. So here he's saying you're creating the domain and put something in the domain, not the domain itself, not the wall, but you're creating the domain and placing something in the domain at the same time, because you're dropping the wall that creates the domain, or the surface that creates the domain, and the object. So he says, do we say that that's the same as Rabbi Yochanan's case? Right. And we treat that also as simultaneity, which we didn't really resolve that question so clearly, although the Gemara hasn't really clearly resolved it, but do we say, the halacha is that it's not considered chayav in that case. If you create the domain by putting something down, it's not considered that you put it down in the domain. If you create something by picking something up from the domain, you create the domain by picking something up. It's not considered that you picked it up from the domain. Okay? So he's saying, would you say the same halacha here? That since the object enters the domain as the domain is created through the same action, it's not considered to be transferring it? Or do we say that no, since when you drop that board, you know that the object's going to bump up. So it's going to come to rest in the domain separately. So let's say like you have a doll on it or something, right? So you drop the board comes down, boom, it made a private domain. the doll is going to bump
In other
and
words,
land.
it's done in a separate action.
It's a separate action because it's going to bump up and fall. So therefore, even though from your standpoint it was the same action, mechanically speaking, it's not the same action because you put that thing down. There's going to be a little moment where it lifts up and settles back down. So it settles in the private domain as a separate action. So yes, your action was just one. You drop the board with the object on it. The board comes, creates a private domain. The object does this, resettles, okay, and gravity brings it down. So is that considered to be a separate action? So it says, Teku, we don't know the answer to that. Amar Rava says, Pshitali, it's clear to me, Mayim al gabe Mayim, Ainu hanachatan, that if you have water on top of water, it's considered to be resting. In other words, if you come to a pit of water, and you take water from the pit of water, and you transfer it, we say that the water was considered at rest in its domain. Even though water moves, right? Water moves. But it's considered at rest in its domain, and when you move it, you're considered to be picking it up from rest. Egoz al gabe mayim. Let's say a shell or a nut is floating on water. Lav hainu hanachatan. If you picked up, let's say you're in a private domain, and you picked a nut is resting on water, we wouldn't say it's at rest. So picking it up is not considered akira. It's not considered picking it up from a state of rest. And remember, in order to violate carrying, you have to pick something up from a state of rest, transfer it, and put it down to a state of rest. So if we consider something floating on water not to be in a state of rest, but Rava said, "Egoz bekliu kli tzaf al gabe mayim mahu." What do we do in a case where there's a nut? You have a little kli, a little vessel that floats on the water, and you put a nut inside. So what do we say? Mi amrinan batar egoz azlinan v'hanaich. Do we say that we look at the nut? And it's all relative. Motion is relative. So from the perspective of the nut, this is all physics issues here. From the perspective of the nut, it's at rest in the vessel. However, odilma batar kliyaz linan v'halonaich. Or do we look at the vessel? The vessel's moving around inside the water. It's relative motion. So we don't know the answer to that. So shemen al gabe yayin. What about oil on top of wine? So you come into your cellar and you take oil. They used to sometimes put oil on top of the wine barrel to protect it. So you take some oil from the top and you carry it outside into the public domain and put it down. Was the oil considered at rest or not? Because it was resting on top of wine. So this is machloket Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri v'Rabbanan. It's a machloket between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanan. Titznan, as we learned in the Mishnah, shemen shetzaf al gabe yayin v'nagat tvul yom b'shemen lo pasal el shemen. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri omer shenehem chibur ze lazeh. That according to the Chachamim, if a tivul yom, if a tamei person who was not a rishon, not an avatuma, and not even a rishon, but someone who would create, who is only a tivul yom, somebody who is of a lesser status of tum'ah. Okay, he's not an avatum'ah, but like right, he's a rishon. He's like a rishon because he went to the mikveh that day. So he's only a rishon. Right. So he's right. He's tamei, but he already went to the mikveh that day and he's waiting for his day to end. So he's sort of in a quasi tamei state. We've had this before. So it's less of a severe state. So he touches the oil. So according to the Chachamim, that doesn't affect the wine because the oil and water don't mix, and oil and wine don't mix. So touching the oil.
You know what was the purpose of the
to protect it. Right? Yeah, to protect it.
The air would not
to get in, right? The bacteria or whatever. So they would take. So if he takes. So therefore, according to the Chachamim, oil and wine are two separate entities. According to Rabbi Yochanan, they are Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. They are one entity. So therefore, according to the Chachamim, if you picked oil up off the top of wine, it's considered to be floating on the wine and not really at rest. Or if you were to bring oil and put it on top of wine, it wouldn't be considered putting it at rest because floating on top of wine is not considered rest. However, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that it's all looked at as one entity, so therefore picking up the oil would be considered just like picking up water from water. We don't say the water's not at rest because it's on top of other water. It's all one entity. So the oil and the wine are considered one entity according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and therefore he would consider that picking it up from a state of rest. So this exact discussion was brought earlier, and I believe it's either Daf Gimel or Daf Daled in Masekhet Shabbat, almost 100 pages ago, this exact discussion. There's a lot of what was on the previous, on today's Daf, and on this Amud is a complete rehashing of
How would you remember that, Rabbi?
What?
How would you remember 100 Daf ago we studied these?
How do I remember it? Just I guess.
Oh, is it mentioned?
Remember the subject. But
No. I mean, I don't remember that it was. I don't remember which exact daf, but I remember it from many. I remember from the beginning of the Masekhet. It's mentioned in the very beginning these cases, and so the question of why they're rehashed here. Obviously, there is a lot of overlap between Perek HaZorek and the first Perek because they deal with issues of carrying, and so bringing up these issues again in the context of the discussion makes sense, although it doesn't seem to be adding anything specific here to what we already knew from the earlier dapim. And we will continue Be'ezrat Hashem tomorrow on page 100, Daf Kuf.